Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Kenny, and on behalf of the project team, the Binchois Consort, Abertay University and the University of Edinburgh, we'd like to welcome you to tonight's event. Now, you just heard an exquisite rendition of Bittering's In Caterina Solenia, part of a wedding motet that we think may have been sung at the wedding of Henry V and Catherine of Valois back on the 2nd of June in 1420. Now, I love that there's almost a kind of wistful plaintiveness to even the most celebratory of music of that time. And that's an aspect of performance that is realised only through the interpretative skill and the musicianship of the consort. But it's important not to overlook the importance of space on how we as audiences interpret and experience music performance. The acoustic of a space is one of those things that really animates sound, and it contributes hugely to that exquisite sense of being enveloped in music. Unfortunately, it's also perhaps the dimension of music performance that is most difficult to control and to replicate between venues. The space that we're in tonight, St. Cecilia's Hall, is an 18th century space in which we're performing music from the 16th century? 15th century? It's a space that is very different to those that Bittering would have known and in which his music would have been performed. And as such then, as audiences and performers, very often we miss out on a very experiential and contextual aspect of music performance. But that is where our project comes in. James.
So really what we're aiming to do here is recreate historical performance, as we've done collectively for many years, but with a new aspect, which is about recreating that within a historical performance space. So we're hoping to bring that aspect of participatory music making, where you have an ensemble and you have an audience, something like tonight, of course, which maybe you don't get even from the best historically informed early music CD. And the other aspect that really is often missing is the idea of space. 15th, 16th century music is really intended as a multimedia and multi-sensory experience. This is a physical reconstruction of a late 15th century church here. We've got absolutely beautiful decoration. You can imagine that, the play of candlelight on the images making the saints come to life in front of you. And again, that's something that we really miss when we're listening to music within our own houses, or even within a concert hall such as this from a different century. What we're aiming to do really is recreate a historical performance in the historical performance space, but in virtual reality.
So, alongside an interest in early music and music performance, I specialise in music technology, with a particular focus on sound synthesis, acoustic modelling, and adaptive sound and music systems. Now, these are all the components that come together to provide the auditory frameworks for today's immersive video games and virtual reality experiences. Now, what video games and VR do exceptionally well is to combine compelling visual and oral content, the game assets, alongside evocative narratives, interactivity, and mathematical models that describe not only the game spaces, but how those assets behave within them. Now, we got to thinking, what would happen if we took those ideas and those technologies and applied them to very different ends? What if, rather than use video game technologies to create game spaces and game experiences, we try to create a collaborative, creative space, a virtual auditorium where we could situate vocalists, instrumentalists, and audiences so that they could experience live and recorded music in completely new ways. So what we'd like to do tonight is to take you on a musical and a technological journey. We'd like to showcase some of the work that we've done on the project so far and show you where we intend to take it over the next few months. Above all, we hope you enjoy the music, but hopefully you'll take away that what we have here is not just a new platform for listening. What we have is a set of cutting-edge musicological tools and methods which have the potential to significantly enhance the way we perform, experience, and perhaps most importantly of all, systematically study music repertoire and its performance. Andrew.
As Kenny said, that piece that we just performed is probably for a wedding. We can't be sure that it was for Henry V and Catherine of Valois' wedding, but it's very likely that it was for a wedding, and certainly a grand one, because it's set around a tenor that sets a few words, sponsus amat sponsam, the bridegroom loves the bride. And around that is weaved this beautiful texture of extra voices, singing texts for St. Catherine of Alexandria. And St. Catherine of Alexandria was a patron saint of, among other things, marriage, because of her famous mystical marriage with Christ. So we're going to go on now to more music for St. Catherine. We're going to start with the responsory Nobilis et Pulchra from Matins of the Feast of St. Catherine. And this piece is actually going to be set not just in chant, but also using a technique called Farburden, which is a parallel motion of voices around the chant, which really just thickens the chant and sort of gives it a big sort of vertical trope, if you will. And that tune, Nobilis et Pulchra, is then going to be the foundation of a mass by Walter Fry that we're going to move on to next. Walter Fry was one of the major figures of the day. He's famous across Europe because not only are copies of his famous Ave Regina Celorum Mass Motet in music manuscripts, but there are also copies basically embedded in pictures. There are two large panels that include what's very clearly, from the notes that are painted in there, this piece, and even in the roof of a French chateau, you see in stucco there's a chunk of Ave Regina Celorum. So he was known everywhere, and certainly would have been known in Scotland. Now, as Kenny said, it's quite possible that some of this music was heard by James IV. We just don't know. We don't know exactly what music was heard in his chapel. What we can say is that all of this music could have been, any of it could have been. When we get to the second half, we'll get onto another mass setting, which was which belongs to a volume called the Carver choirbook, which was probably associated with the actual seat of the Royal Chapel in Stirling, but may have circulated to the other royal foundations, including Linlithgow, which we're particularly concerned with as well. So we have this kind of mix in this choirbook of pieces from as far back as the 1450s. Dufay's L'Homme Armé Mass is in there, very old by the time the choirbook was put together, around the turn of the century, had a very long gestation period. We've also got important music from England, and we think a couple of masses from Scotland, but James and I will say a little bit more about that later. The project that you're looking at is involved in looking at, in a sense, foundations in the sense of the walls of a building which has now lost its roof and windows and so on. With the mass that we're going to perform an example of now, you'll see another use of these foundations. I mentioned a few minutes ago that the tenor of this mass by Fry uses the tune Nobilis et Pulchra that we're going to hear nakedly and in Farburden first of all. And then around that tenor, you've got three other voices weaving this wonderful arabesque of music. And this is a standard constructional procedure at the time. The tenor is like, as a great theorist pointed out in the 14th century, like the foundation of a house. And around that, you build the walls and the fabrics and all the rest of it. So there's clearly a sort of architectural parallel there as well in terms of the rest of the project that we're involved with. So, Nobilis et Pulchra and the Kyrie of Fry's Mass on that same one.
Nobilis et Pulchra, prudens Caterina,
Our project focuses on using virtual reality not just to recreate long-lost historic spaces, but to recreate the experience, and particularly the acoustic experience of inhabiting them. Now, sound is one of those key elements that we use to make sense of the world around us and our position within it. We use it to localize spaces. We use it to judge speed and distance. We use it to assess the solidity and the tactility of the objects that surround us. And yet, it's one of those key points of interface that is all too often overlooked or neglected in virtual reality in particular. Not long ago, I spoke to Laura Dillaway, part of the development team behind Guerrilla Games Rigs, which is a sporting VR combat game. And she told me that the developers invested so much time and effort in creating a control system that didn't induce vomiting in the players, that the sound was little more than an afterthought tacked on at the end. Now, as committed audiophiles, we thought that was a bit sad. And what we wanted to do then was to create an immersive auditory experience that uses music performance as a focal point, situated within two contrasting acoustic spaces, St. Cecilia's Hall and the chapel at Linlithgow Palace. Now, St. Cecilia's Hall opened its doors for the first time in 1763. As we said, it was Scotland's first custom-built concert hall. And even today, it remains one of the few places in the world where you can hear 18th century music performed on 18th century instruments in an 18th century performance space. At least to a point. Because the heyday of the hall was glorious, but relatively short-lived. Although it was a focus for the very best in Scottish music, the Music Society that commissioned the hall faced mounting and substantial debts, and eventually in 1798 it folded and had to sell up. The hall went through a succession of alternative uses and was extensively remodelled. The space that we're in just now is a contemporary reimagining of that historic space. When Edinburgh University took ownership in 1959, this room was rectangular and had Victorian windows in the east wall. Now, we know what this modern space sounds like. For me, the question is, how close does it get to the acoustics of the original? Well, fortunately, we've got detailed architectural records from the time, and that has allowed us to create a very detailed mathematical model of that historic space. And that allows us not just to visualize the space, but to oralize it. We can position virtual sound sources in our mathematical model and calculate what happens to sound waves as they propagate out within it. We can calculate how much of the sound is absorbed by the atmosphere, how much is absorbed and reflected as the sound waves bounce off the plaster walls, as they come into contact with the wooden floor, and as they meet the ruddy, fleshy audiences that inhabit it. What that allows us to do is essentially create a sonic fingerprint of the space that we can artificially impose on modern recordings afterwards. In fact, yesterday, the project team spent the day with the consort in an anechoic chamber, a space that is specifically designed to have a neutral and very dead acoustic, so that we'd have a set of reference recordings to use for just that purpose. Now, the process for the chapel at Linlithgow Palace is broadly similar, although it's actually perhaps even more of a challenge, because the building is little more than a shell, and we can only really infer detail of the music that may have been performed there. But working with specialists from Historic Environment Scotland, we've been out on site and used LADAR, a form of laser telemetry, to create a very detailed mathematical model of the space as it currently is. And over the coming weeks and months, we'll be working with one of Historic Scotland's architectural historians to reconstruct virtually the interior of the space, adding layers of digital plasterwork, wood panelling, drapes, and fabric hangings. And once complete, for the very first time, we'll be able to sit in the throne of King James IV and hear that Easter Mass cycle just as he would have heard it back in 1512. Andrew.
Well, I don't know how much we can emulate the sound that James IV would have heard, but we'll do our best. I want to take you back now to the first piece and to what I was talking about a few minutes ago, namely the verse of Virgo Flagellator, the famous responsory for St. Catherine that was used as the basis of that motet. We're going to return now to that same piece, and you're going to hear the entire responsory again using Farburden. And then we're going to move on to another kind of fragment. We deal with fragments all the time in this business, it seems. And that's a fragment of a piece of music that's been fully reconstructed by my colleague Philip Weller, with a little help from myself, James, and the members of the consort. What you find very frequently at this period is that English music comes to us simply in the form of fragments, because, as you surely know, at the Reformation, most of the music manuscripts that existed, along with everything else associated with idolatry, was destroyed. And what wasn't destroyed then, really, when we got to the Civil War, they did a pretty good job of finishing things off at that point. So all that we have, really, from that period, apart from music that's been transmitted onto the continent, of which there's quite a lot, and, including the Carver choirbook that's been transmitted back via, presumably, the Old Alliance to Scottish source. What you see, apart from those manuscripts, really, for the most part, is just little fragments, just sheets of music that have been used as binding material, so stuffed into the bindings of books. Now, don't take this as an invitation to go along to your local library and cut through the 16th century bindings of books, because it's been done before and it didn't end beautifully. But probably as time goes on, we're going to find more and more of these fragments in the bindings of books. This is a case in point. In a manuscript in Pembroke College Library, Cambridge, there's a single leaf which contains the complete tenor set mensurally, set in countable note values, and about 2/3 of the contratenor, none of the descanters, because it's just one leaf, and there was another leaf that faced that, which is now lost. So to make that come to reality, we've had to use a bit of imagination, just as we're going to in reconstructing the building. And that's the result that you're going to hear tonight. I'll leave you to judge whether you think it's an appropriate effort or not. We've certainly had some interesting discussions about that between us. From that point, then, we're going to move to the last number of this grouping, and that's the Agnus Dei of the same Mass by Fry that you heard the Kyrie of a little bit earlier. So 3 pieces which kind of will build and accumulate on each other. And Walter Fry's a pretty good composer, even though he's not quite as good as we are.
So the idea of fragments are really very central to our project. We've got the example that Andrew was talking about there, the second piece of that little trilogy, where we have a piece which survives in an incomplete state. We could have chosen to perform just chunks of that. It wouldn't have been entirely satisfactory. Hopefully you enjoyed it rather more with our additions. And of course there are other types of fragments here as well. This is a fragmentary building. This is Linlithgow Palace, in fact the chapel of it, which we are aiming to recreate. This music is for this chapel, and we could have had the concert there. It's really, really hard to sing in because there is no roof, so the whole sound just disappears. Moreover, we're in the grips of Storm Hector at the moment, so we would all have been blown away and probably wouldn't be able to hold your music very well either. So we do have a lot of challenges there. We have to try and recreate that space. But actually, I think the biggest challenge we have in terms of fragments is the repertory. Andrew's spoken a little bit about English music being fragmentary. Scottish music is far more so. It's extremely hard to find things that will work as 15th century works by Scottish composers. I have an example here. This represents a fairly large percentage of the surviving repertoire of Scottish 15th century music. It is found on that slate tile there from the roof of Paisley Abbey, which was discovered in a drain. We would struggle to build a convincing and interesting concert, let alone a virtual reality experience around that. So there is a real challenge here, finding music which is historically viable, which can be pinned on actual events and be plausible. We could have just written a load of music in the style of and tried to get away with it, but I don't think we would have done. But there are a number of approaches we can take here. One of these is to take a real historical event. We know that James IV spent Easter at Linlithgow Palace in 1512. We know he came there with exactly half of the Chapel Royal at the time, down the road from Stirling Chapel, where they had their slightly more permanent residence. We also know that James V was born there the day before Easter Sunday, and in fact was baptised there in the Linlithgow Palace Chapel following Mass, which we know James IV heard. So we have a nice event that we can at least pin some music around. We know that James IV was there with half the Chapel Royal on Easter Sunday, 1512, with his infant son, the future James V, to be baptised afterwards. Sadly, we lack any music for Easter that is polyphonic for Scotland, but we do know that at this time Scotland was following the Sarum Rite, which is essentially the Salisbury version of the liturgy. There were various attempts to create a new Scottish rite, the Aberdeen Rite, which was based very heavily on the Salisbury Rite in the end. But what this does mean is that we know exactly what kind of chants would have been used, the proper chants for Easter Sunday, and we can use these. Sadly, it was a large, expensive and an important event. We know there would have been polyphony, particularly for the ordinary items, and we just don't have any of that surviving. So what we're going to do in our virtual reality reconstruction, and indeed following in the next section of music, are the propers, the chant items that we know would have been heard at that particular time. We've decided to elaborate them slightly. This is our attempt to make them as grand and regal as possible by using a compositional practice known as frobodon. And we've reconstructed this from a Scottish treatise which tells you exactly how to do that. So this is as good as we're going to get, I think, for being able to pin music on a particular event. Our other approach for the music after the interval is to try and look at some of the material from the older part of the Carver choirbook. So we know that this was in the possession of the Chapel Royal. This is the Chapel Royal in Stirling, or a slightly later version of it anyway, on the left here. And this is the original opening here of the Mass that we'll be performing after the interval. This piece is clearly not from the 16th century, like a lot of the Carver books. It's very obviously a 15th century work. So it's round about the right date for the very first opening of Linlithgow Palace Chapel. It's been variously described as being continental and as being English. I'm pretty sure it's neither. The reason that people have called it English is because it has a troped, very long Kyrie like we heard earlier. However, the version of the text isn't one that is found anywhere in England. it's actually found in French sources where most of the chant came to Scotland from. However, in Scotland they would never have sung a Prosula Kyrie in this. As far as I'm concerned, this is probably the only surviving 15th century Scottish mass cycle, which we're going to perform for you later. Okay, so first we're going to start with some items for Easter, so the Mass propers with a bit of flabbergal. And over to Andrew. We're going to go and pour some wine for you later.
Day